This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Great, thank you. And thank you all for coming. It's really nice to do joint seminars. I'm with the History of Sexuality, and it's really exciting to see where the paths cross over. And I think we'll all touch on sexuality today in what we're going to mention as well. So I'm going to talk briefly about blogging and social media from a PhD student perspective. There was an excellent talk here a few weeks ago run by History Lab, specifically on that, on blogging and using Twitter or even Instagram for ECRs and PhD students. And I'll tweet the Storify link later, which is probably the most social media thing I've ever said. But Jane Winters from IHR spoke for about 40 minutes, and then History Lab storified it. So there's some great tips on there, specifically for PhD students. But I'm just going to talk about my experience. So I've been blogging, this is my blog here, and I started blogging last October. So I got my lovely 1-year anniversary from WordPress email about a month ago, which was quite nice to realise what you've achieved in a year and how many words you've written that could have gone into your PhD, and words that couldn't, but you've made use of them anyway. But I started blogging a bit before that, and the first thing I'd say to PhD students or MA students or anyone who wants to get interested and start in blogging is blog for someone else. So the first blog I wrote was for the Sheffield History Matters blog, which is brilliant. I think it's won several awards. And they have fantastic pieces. They've done quite a few History Month editions as well. And they have lots of different people blogging for them. They have their students in the department, their staff in the department, and academics and public historians from all over the country. So I started there because I read a piece 2 summers ago, I think, about Stephen Fry, who wrote a letter to the Olympic Committee about Sochi. Talking about, as someone who's Jewish and queer, how important it was that we made a stand against Sochi. So I read it and thought, this is really interesting from using public history, Stephen Fry talking about it. If I wrote about that in a newspaper, I don't think anyone would be like, Claire Hayward said that. But it's Stephen Fry, and it really makes an impact, and I think that's something that's really important to public history is celebrity endorsement. But I wrote to Caroline, who runs History Matters, and said, this is what I do. And I read it, and I just thought, is anyone blogging on it? And she said, no, can you get a piece to me tomorrow? So I just thought, that's the first lesson in blogging, is it's so quick. The quicker you can do it, the more impact it has. And the more outreach it gets, the more it tags into what people are already talking about. So I managed to write one in an evening, which was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do, because you have to go over these 800 words and make it really different. But Caroline was really helpful, and the first thing I would say is, if you do contact other blogs, ask for their guidelines. So lots of people who run collaborative blogs, and I'm sure Justin will talk about this later, they have guidelines, and that was really the first step for me, because it was, I'd read lots of blogs before, but I hadn't thought about their construction. So it's stuff like, make sure it's absolutely no more than 850 words, and make sure your paragraphs are no more than 6 lines. And they're things I wouldn't even have thought of before. But with the guidelines, it was absolutely the best place to start. And Caroline was brilliant and really helpful, and it ended up being picked up by Stephen Fry, who tweeted about it and wrote a comment on it, which was, I think, I might put on my CV. But that was another thing I was going to mention is it gets you noticed as well, which is, I think, really important for PhD students and ECRs. People aren't going to read your work unless you put it out there. And with academic articles and with books, how long down the line is that going to be? But with any form of social media, getting out there as a PhD student is really important. To get your name out there, to get your voice out there, and to scope out what other people are doing as well. And it can be really confidence boosting when you realise that actually people are reading this. It's not just, used to sitting at home and reading it to your cat or your partner and they're not listening. But if you put it out there, people are interested. And I think that's really important as when you start out, is having a bit of a confidence boost and knowing that people actually think you know what you're talking about, which is really good. So I'd advise to start off, write for someone else, and don't start your own blog unless you have the time to keep up with it. And this I found hard at first, because I thought, okay, I've tried it, I'm going to write something now, I'm going to write my own one, and then it comes up on WordPress. This is the platform I use. There's several others. And it will say when you're designing it, how often do you want to blog? Because it will encourage you, and it will send you a reminder saying, where have you been? You haven't been blogging. So you can set it so you aim to blog for once a week or once a month. So I've set mine for once a month, and I've managed to do at least one blog post once a month. And I think maybe one of those was the last day of the month when I read the email saying, you haven't done your post this month. I thought I really need to keep this going, otherwise next month I'll go, I'll wait. And Jane Winters, who gave the talk at the History Lab, was saying sometimes it's better to not have a social media platform than have one that you're absent on, because it just looks bad and people can see, if you click on any blog post, it'll come up saying when it was. So if that said 2012, I'd look at it and go, well, I haven't updated it recently. What does that say? Where's their new stuff? So that's really important. Do not do it unless you have the time. If you do have the time, great. If you don't have the time, then keep a list of people who do write collaborative blogs and email them when you have an idea. Otherwise, it can just look terrible. The next thing is to think about why you're doing it, which I didn't when I first started. But it's thinking about why are you doing this? Are you doing it because social media is a thing for historians now? Are you doing it because you've been told by someone in your department to do it? Are you doing it to practice writing outside of academia, practice writing to other people? And how are you going to do that? So I hadn't thought about it before as a methodological exercise, but it is the same way as you think, why am I writing this article? Why am I writing this thesis? Why are you writing a blog? Who's it for? Is it for other academics to spin off ideas with them? Is it for the general public? Is it for people who work in a specific sector? Because each different audience needs a different voice almost, and they want different things. And you can experiment with that, I guess, which leads on to talk to other people, read other blogs, comment on other blogs, because that's another way to get your voice out there, listened to and responded to. And out of that come opportunities as well, and respond to other blogs. So I've written blog posts responding to other blog posts before, and out of that I've been asked to write for the National Council of Public History's blog in America, because I wrote a perspective from England on public history, responding to one they'd written. And small things come out of it. I also won tickets to Romania through one of my blogs, which doesn't happen very often, but I responded to a Telegraph article about 21 reasons why you should hate museums. And I read it with anger and waited a day or two to write a response slightly more neutrally. And so I wrote 21 reasons to love them, and on the advice of my supervisor, Nicola, I sent it to the Telegraph, thinking, well, nothing's going to come of this. Next thing I know, they sent me an email saying, check the Telegraph tomorrow and you can go to Romania. So I bizarrely won 2 flights to Romania, even though they'd edited it down quite a lot. But I wouldn't have got that if I hadn't blogged it. So I think it's really important that you do take a bit of a chance as a PhD student, and maybe blog about something that some people might think is a bit too controversial, or you're using a non-academic voice, but use your personality with it. Same as you would hope a bit in your writing, you've got a lot of space to do it. And I think the most important thing for me is to have fun with it as well. So I've done various different blogs, some of pictures. I've gone on museum trails, I've gone on walking tours. The blog post I wrote before this one was a review of an exhibition. And I talk about the methodology of that. This one that I posted earlier in the week is just videos that I like. So I'm really interested in the way that museums use social media, and one of the ways is making exhibition trailers. So I've collected together my favourite ones, which was such a pleasure to do, because it was saying, here are things that I like, and look, here's a list of them, enjoy them. And then the Wellcome Collection sent me some other ones that they'd done, and it's a really good way of having fun and almost remembering why you started the research or whatever you're doing in the first place, sparking a new avenue, and getting to see really cool videos and pull things together. So I think planning, making it worth your while as a PhD student, taking a bit of a risk, but also having fun, because I wouldn't be able to print this off and put it in my thesis, because, they're videos. But I get to do it here, and it's a really good platform, and you can share them on Twitter and then have more conversations, and there are other videos out there that I didn't know existed, and someone will tweet them to me. So now I've got months of procrastination that I can call research. But without the blog, you don't get a chance to do that. Sorry, Nicola. You don't get a chance to do that. So it's really it's having fun as well as being quite academic about it. And I think it's an exercise that most PhD students should do, even if they blog for a small department website or anyone's. But give it a go. If it goes wrong, you can just delete the website. But give it a chance first, definitely. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Claire.
Hello.
Over to you, Justin, and thank you for the next perspective.
Thank you.
You keep your questions if you've got any to Claire in your mind, or take this one.
All right, so I am speaking to you today about running a collaborative blog. So I want to give some background on Notches, Remarks on the History of Sexuality, which has been going just about a year now. It started on January 6th, earlier this year. On the same day, it was timed to coincide with the IHR History of Sexuality seminar, and they're linked. We have many of the people that give us give papers at the seminar also write blogs about their papers on Notches, and many of us that are conveners, not many, several of us that are conveners on the seminar are actively involved with the blog, either as editors like Julia here, my co-founder, or some of our contributors who are in this room, potentially people who should be contributors as well. I'm looking at Craig. So Notches started primarily, Notches and the IHR seminar had a similar impetus behind them, that there wasn't really provision in this country for ways to create a community around the history of sexuality, or ways to create a forum that brought people together around the history of sexuality, despite the fact that it's such a vibrant field within history, and so many of us are working in it. And we have our own individual networks, and there might be smaller seminars or conferences, obviously, that bring together people, but there was nothing that went across theme, across period, across region in the way that either the seminar or the blog do. And that's precisely the goal of the blog, is to bring together conversations across all of these things. We're not limited to any period or region, and in fact we're trying to go as widely as possible. So when Julia and I sat down late in 2013 sometime and started plotting what we were going to put together, these were the primary interests that we had. And afterwards, we got involved. It's now the blog is now sponsored by the Raphael Samuel History Centre here in London, whose mission is to make history accessible to the widest possible public. And so that's been a goal for Notches as well, that even though we bring together primarily a lot of academics, but also we've had contributions from activists and community members as well. Primarily, we have submissions from postgrads, early career scholars, and occasionally senior scholars as well. But the focus is to avoid academic jargon, avoid inaccessibility, really make what are the current debates in the history of sexuality accessible to everyone. So in terms of the guidelines that Claire was talking about before, we're probably less rigid on some of the formatting issues, but very rigid on making sure that our content is accessible and written for a wider public in mind. The focus as well has been on having contributions that are international in focus. So our contributors, we've got contributors from all over the place. We have about 40 contributors off and on. Some have kind of fallen by the wayside, and some become much more active contributors. It's put together by a team of, in addition to Julia and I, there's 4 other editors that are roughly responsible for periods or regions within the history of sexuality, and a woman in the States who's responsible for special features. So she deals with reviews, with interviews with authors, and any initiatives any new initiatives that come forward that aren't just sort of standard blog posts. But I thought what I'd start with in terms of the discussion are the triumphs, because Notches has far exceeded our expectations in terms of its reach and its impact. we have had, as of about a week or two ago, we reached the threshold of 100,000 views since starting in January, which I think Julie and I were excited and were like tweeting when we hit like our first 1,000 and our first 2,000, because we thought these are big numbers. We're getting something really big here. We didn't expect in February, March that we'd be hitting 100,000 before the end of the year. So we're hoping now for the next year to hit 250,000 and keep growing beyond that. We've had 100,000 views. We've also got a lot of active subscribers, which we didn't expect either. So we have almost 3,000 people signed up as active subscribers who receive every single post in their email. And these are people that have self-selected to be on a mailing list to receive everything, rather than us surreptitiously sending it out. We also promote it through HistSex. Every post goes out there to their subscriber list, which is 2,500 people. And our social media presence has had the biggest impact on our readership through Facebook and Twitter. That's still where we get most of our hits, is through social media sharing. And because we have six individuals working editorially and 40 contributors, we have an incredible reach in terms of incredible breadth of communities in Europe and in North America that we can access when people start sharing posts, not to mention readers that then start sharing. And sometimes it's astonishing just how far something will go and how much sharing, how much viewership it'll get. In addition, we've been featured on the History News Network, so a large online history presence in the States, based at George Mason University, I think. About.com has featured us as well when we were starting up through their Sexuality stream. And individual posts have been freshly pressed by WordPress 3 times. The most recent one was our Remembrance Day piece by Julia herself that was freshly pressed. And what this means, like Claire, we use WordPress as our platform for Notches. And because we're on WordPress, the editors of WordPress some of them follow us as well and will receive our posts. And for ones that they think make a particularly unique contribution or an interesting perspective that's not addressed elsewhere, which is exactly what we're trying to do after all, they will then promote it through their channels to the worldwide WordPress community. So that every single time that has happened, that's increased our viewership as well, often to audiences that we don't necessarily access as readily, individuals who wouldn't necessarily find themselves drawn to a history or a history of sexuality blog. Sometimes this is fantastic and gives us perspectives that we don't get in the comments, and sometimes this is troubling, giving us perspectives we don't often get in the comments. So we have had some moderation issues once in a while, and comments that have been troublesome and offensive that we've had to deal with, which is interesting because we don't get that. We don't get that from academics that are embedded in the history of sexuality, but it's good for us to be reminded that there's work that we're doing and outreach that we're trying to do and perspectives that we're trying to impart that are significant, relevant, and valid and important this day and age. Because sometimes I think in our bubble of academia, we forget that not everyone thinks like us, and we forget that there's still repression and homophobia and whatnot outside of our worlds when we don't experience it firsthand. And through Notches, we have encountered that sometimes. So it's interesting to bring us into contact with that. Also, what's been incredibly validating is Notches is increasingly being recognized in the field of the history of sexuality as a valid voice that's being cited, that's being discussed, that's coming up in talks around the country. And our bloggers are getting increased prominence for their work and increased exposure for their work through that, which is fantastic, particularly for graduate students, as Claire mentioned, where it's really important to get your name out there and your work out there. But for those of us that are early career, or those of us that are even more established, it still gives access to other audiences. And for those of us that are early career or on the job market, this is a really important way of demonstrating our service to the field, impact inside and outside the academy. And Notches is deliberately set up to help promote that as well. So in order to achieve those triumphs, of course, there's tactics. I mentioned The guidelines, of course, we're very specific with our contributors on what we need from them, and maintaining that voice and tone is what we think is particularly important, and what sets Notches aside from some other blogs that might be more casually conversational or more. We're intellectually rigorous, but like I said, we avoid being inaccessible. And certainly there's some blogs that are written purely for academics that don't access the same audience that we do, but that's not their goal either, so that's fine. Having a concentrated and deliberate social media presence that feeds off of our Facebook, feeds to our Twitter, feeds to X, Y, and Z, and that also gets retweeted and shared by contributors and editors, that's absolutely critical. That having that deliberate and strategic social media presence has an obvious impact from post to post. When we're a bit more lax, it doesn't get out there as much. When we really sort of have the time to drive that forward, we see the consequences of that immediately, within hours sometimes. It really matters. Having multiple contributors, well, a collaborative blog obviously only works when there's enough people collaborating, and having a lot of people involved in Notches is what's made it successful, bringing in a multitude of voices. Also having dedicated expert editors has been critical, because we're not all experts in the fields that we're reading on. And ultimately what Notches has done has created a sort of blog forum that's peer review light. We put a lot of time into individual posts. They can be reviewed by anything from 2 to 4 editors, and these are pieces that are 800 to 1,200 words. So anything from 2 to 4 editors, they might go through anything from 2 to 20 revisions. So that's what we go through to get a piece ready for publication, which is incredibly time-consuming. And that's what I'd say is the biggest obstacle, is the amount of time that goes into operating a collaborative blog, because there's every quality of writer that we involved in the blog, from people that are very, very established scholars with excellent writing and a sense for how to write for a diverse audience, to individuals that are new to blogging or that are developing their writing skills and need a bit more of a hand moving forward. So that's definitely an issue, the time that goes into that. And I would say, yeah, going back to social media, relying on things like this, relying on speaking to Twitter historians on Twitter, accessing that and accessing audiences that are active on social media, and the hissex hashtag as well. There's been times where I've done a search on hissex and I've basically taken over the entire thing for a month, where it's just everything I post is hissex and drowns out a lot of other things going on sometimes. But this is what we need to promote, work that's going on. It starts conversations. And it's been incredibly rewarding. Like I said, Notches has now gone beyond our expectations and has every promise of continuing to do so into the future. And we're at the point now where we have, initially we were really struggling as a brand new blog to get contributors regularly submitting and regularly publishing new material. And now we're so fortunate that we've developed a following and developed a prominence that people are approaching us now to submit to Notches, which I encourage everyone to do. Use us to your advantage. Submit to Notches work that they're working on in their own theses. We have authors of new books that are submitting blogs. Actually, yeah, yours, Jennifer here submitted an excellent blog post that was timed to coincide with the publication of her book. Fantastic. This is to be used both for enhancing our own writing and intellectual progress, and also self-promotion. We're all struggling to get ahead and build our academic profiles, employment opportunities, and I encourage everyone to use the Notches blog and other blogs to their fullest advantage. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you, Justin. And last but very much not least, Jennifer Evans, thank you.
I would say the reason before I start that I ended up blogging for Notches actually ties in with social media, because I met one of your editors through Twitter and she wrote a blog post for my blog, and then she tweeted me to say, why don't you do one for Notches? So the whole connection, the whole link was totally down to social media. And actually I think Catherine and I have only met about once in real life, but talk all the time online. So I'm just going to show you the blog that I'm going to be talking about today. And then I've got some nice little PowerPointy type pictures for everyone to look at. So I'm actually here as kind of a semi-stand-in for Ciara Meehan, who's had to go and do some other things. But as you can see, we run the blog together, so hopefully I'll be just as knowledgeable about how it runs as she would be if she was here. And as we've gone through how to do it as a PhD and as an early career, I thought I would talk about something slightly different, which is what you can do as I don't think of myself as an established scholar, as someone with a job. Maybe that's how I think of myself. Once you're in a new job, how you can use social media to your advantage. Both Ciara and I were already on social media. We both have blogs. Ciara's is under her name, and mine is earlymodernmedicine.com, which is, as it says on the tin, a blog about early modern medicine, which is, I started as an early career scholar on my own, and would definitely second that if you don't have time, don't do it. And I actually changed mine because of time constraints when I got a job. I took on another editor, and it's now a semi-collaborative kind of endeavour. So we were both used to using blogs and Twitter and Facebook for various things, and Ciara and I decided we wanted to run a conference on perceptions of pregnancy, which had similar aims to the Notches blog. We were fed up being constrained by time period and country, and we wanted to go way beyond everything and have everyone talk to everybody else. And so we spent our time doing all the normal things you would do to set up and run a conference if you weren't using social media. But we decided very early on in our planning process that social media was going to be a key element of what we wanted to do with the conference and where the conference would end up as an entity after the conference itself. And so the first thing we did was, before we'd actually got any funding or anything like that, was we set up a Twitter account for the conference, which originally was under the handle @PregnancyConf. It has now changed because that's the great thing with social media, you can adapt it as the kind of entity itself changes. And we set that up probably a good year before the conference was running. And we started using the hashtags Twitterstorians and HistMed and HistSex for some of them to generate interest, both to connect with potential speakers, but also to kind of get out there to the wider world of what was going on. We had some really great feedback about using Twitter, which was very, very nice. And we used it all the way in the run-up to the conference, through the conference, and since. And one of the reasons we were using it is because we'd set up the blog that I just showed you, and we were using social media to drive interest in the blog. And the blog was connected very much to perceptions of pregnancy as a conference, and so we had columns and interest items and blog posts by people who were going to be speaking at the conference, or people who knew they couldn't make the conference but still wanted to be involved, would post things, and then we'd share those on Twitter. And in the months just before the conference, nowhere near as impressive in numbers as Notches has got, but in the months before the conference, we saw a massive jump in people visiting the blog through Twitter and Facebook and other places where we were sharing it. And we also then used the blog to organise the conference, to give people information about accommodation, where they could stay, travelling, all of those kinds of bits and pieces. But it also allowed people to connect with each other before the conference happened. So all of that was really great, and it allowed us to reach beyond boundaries and borders, which was our little tagline, beyond boundaries and borders. And we had speakers from all around the world, and originally when we planned the conference it was going to be quite small, and it ended up being quite huge. As Rob can attest, he was there. There was a lot of people, people from Australia, Canada, America, Europe, all around the world came to Hatfield for the conference, and it was absolutely brilliant. And on the day, or well, the 3 days, as our one-day conference ended up being a 3-day affair. The 3-day conference also was live tweeted, and we had people tweeting in questions. which I have to say was quite terrifying. I answered my first live tweeted question, and it's weird when you can't see someone's face, but it was a really enjoyable experience. And so that was the kind of some of the initial benefits of using social media. The downsides that we found very early on was that our Twitter account, because it's about pregnancy, was very quickly being picked up by an awful lot of companies that have something to sell to do with pregnancy. Lots of, I don't know what you call them, birthing coaches, people telling you need to be skinny straight away after you've had a baby. Those were my least favourite ones. All kinds of things that Ciara and I knew we didn't want to be promoting, because at the end of the day it was still an academic endeavour and an intellectual conversation rather than trying to sell something. So we had to have quite a few conversations very early on about who we would follow back. Anyone who followed us who was selling something or was advocating a particular position would not get a follow back from us. And the reason I say advocate a position is because although the conference was about perceptions of pregnancy, Ciara was actually speaking on abortion and I was speaking on miscarriage, and the conference was about all aspects of reproduction. And so we also very quickly had advocacy groups from a whole range of perspectives on women's bodies and reproductive issues. And so it was again the same thing. Who do you want to be associated with? Who do you want showing up on your timeline? And you have to be strong and take a stance and not fall into the trap of, oh, well, they've retweeted us and I'm sure they're very nice. You need to know exactly what you want to appear as online and know who you're talking to. And so very early on, we made a lot of decisions about who we would and would not follow and who we would and would not retweet. And we had lots of people like that also asking if they could write for the blog. And so you have to develop a very nice, polite, thank you very much for your interest. Unfortunately, we only promote the work of academics and select others. You have to find a nice way of wording it, because we do publish blog posts from journalists and a whole range of people and some activists for particular types of groups, but they tend to know what we're doing and are happy to work within our kind of framework and not push ideas that we don't want pushed. So I would say if you're going to be online, you need to have a backbone about who you want to be seen as, and you need to stick to your guns and not be sucked in. The greatest thing I think for us about social media was the connections that it allowed us to make. So during the conference, as I say, panels and papers were being live tweeted, but the conference also allowed us to connect with other blogs and other people on social media. And so we now know one of the editors from Nursing Clio, and we can recommend bloggers to each other, and we retweet their things, they retweet our things, and you get a much bigger audience. The live tweeting of the conference sessions was very interesting, and it went very well, but we had quite a few. We had 2 art historians, and we had someone doing their PhD on Durex adverts. And while if you take a picture and post it to Twitter, it's your work, you own the rights to it and you can publish it. For those people whose presentations include images that are copyrighted, you are publishing those again on Twitter and you are not necessarily allowed to do it. And so we ran into some problems with people, because the Durex adverts were just fantastically interesting. People were taking quite clear images of those and tweeting them, and of course publishing them, and we had to ask them to take them down. One of the ways we got around that was asking everybody before their session if they had any copyright issues, if they were happy to be tweeted. The 2 art historians did not have any photos tweeted from their papers because they didn't have the copyright for the images that they were showing. They had the right to use them for an academic paper, not to have them online. So it's another thing to think about with live tweeting, is where the copyright rules lie. We also made quite a few connections in the public sphere as well, which was great. After the conference, we changed the blog and the Twitter handles to reflect the fact that we're now a research network on perceptions of pregnancy, and lots of our speakers have still been producing blogs. This blog is actually by one of our own PhD students and was picked up by the Twitter feed for Call the Midwife, who retweeted it. As you can see, for heaven's sake, don't call this midwife. And we had so many views on the back of that and so much more interest. Quite a few of our posts have also been picked up by the broadsheet.ie, partly, I think, because Ciara seems to know everybody in Ireland. But it's not just her connections. A lot of it has come through Twitter. And so this blog post here on medieval abortion was picked up and run, taken from our blog and run on the newspaper's website. Again, we ran into there are interesting people in the world who are not as academically open-minded as the people you're used to talking to. Both this speaker from our conference and Ciara have written public pieces in Ireland on abortion and have, you can imagine, I don't probably even need to tell you what happened. Thinking about your audience and the country where things are being published in is particularly important. Ciara, I think, probably had the worst that I've ever seen in that they tracked her down on Twitter and harassed her quite extensively, and when she stopped interacting with pro-lifers on Twitter, they searched her down on Facebook, even though her Facebook account is entirely personal and private, and started sending her messages through the message function there and harassing her on Facebook, to the point that she changed her name on Facebook so that they can't find her. So if you are talking about issues that are sensitive, which many of us who are involved in the history of bodies and sexuality end up talking about, you need to have a relatively thick skin as well, and just be aware that there are people out there that, not everyone's going to harass you, but there are people that are quite vociferous in their commenting and how they interact with you. We then moved on to Facebook as well after the conference. We didn't do Facebook before the conference because Twitter was working so well for us and it reaches a much broader audience, and we didn't really feel the need to. But Facebook has actually brought us new researchers into the network and new audience members, and it's a really nice forum to keep the discussion going because people can chat on the Facebook page without it being a comment on somebody else's blog, and they can share things. But we mostly use the Facebook page to share our blog posts. We also share a lot of calls for papers and calls for publications and things, and so we do it all through there. So I think for us, using social media to enhance our conference was absolutely fantastic, and we got speakers and blog posts and research that we never would have had access to without it. It was a lot of hard work, and it does take a lot of time. And actually, since the conference, we now have appointed 2 associate directors for the research network, because updating the blog, the Twitter feed, the Facebook page, and we run a weekly newsletter takes a lot of time. And so there's now 4 of us on a rotation, 1 for Britain, 1 for Ireland, 1 for North America and regions, and 1 for Europe. We will probably have to hire or acquire some more people as well, because it is a lot of work. So do take the time. But I think I would echo what's been said already, in that know what you want social media to do for you and have those aims in mind when you start, whether it be a blog or making a profile for yourself, which is what I used it for initially, or using it to create a profile for a conference. Know what your aims are and be prepared to stick to them. And I'll leave it there because I've waffled.
Thank you. So perhaps a short round of applause for your speakers.